The Sumerians, Mesopotamia's first civilization, a 30-minute comprehensive talk. And Introduction. Setting the stage, they 4 minutes. Opening hook, 1:30. Imagine a world with no cities, no writing, no organized religion, no schools, no written laws, and no concept of time as we know it. Then, along the banks of two unpredictable rivers in what is now southern Iraq, a people appeared who invented all of it. The Sumerians didn't just build a civilization, they created the template for urban life that every subsequent society would follow. Their innovations, from the wheel to the first epic poem, from irrigation systems to the 60-minute hour, still shape our daily lives, often without us realizing it. Core questions 30 to 230. Today, we're going to answer 4 fundamental questions. 1. Who were these mysterious people, and where did they come from? 2. How did their society from small farming villages into the world's first urban civilization? 3. Who were their gods and kings, and what did they believe? 4. And finally, what happened to them? Where did the Sumerians go? Geographic and historical context 230:00. To understand the Sumerians, you must first understand their land. Mesopotamia, from the Greek meaning land between the rivers, sits between the Tigris and Euphrates. But this was no gentle paradise. The rivers flooded unpredictably and violently. The Greek historian Herodotus once described Mesopotamia as having more fruitful land by far than anywhere else. But that fruitfulness came at a price: constant labor to control the waters. Yet this very challenge forced innovation. The Sumerians called their land Kangir, meaning country of the noble lords. Today this region is south-central Iraq, a fact that reminds us that ancient history is not abstract. It happened in places people still call home. 2. The Dawn of Sumer, Origins and Evolution 4 to 9 minutes. The Ubaid Foundation 4 to 5:30. The story doesn't begin with the Sumerians themselves. Between 6500 and 1000 BCE, a people we call the Ubaidans, named after the archaeological site El Ubaid, settled the region. These were the pioneers. They drained the marshes, created the first irrigation ditches, and established the first farming communities. Archaeological evidence shows they built small shrines that would eventually become the great ziggurats. They wove textiles, worked with pottery, and crucially, they brewed beer, a beverage so important that later Sumerian hymns would praise it. The Linguistic Mystery 530:00. When the people we call Sumerians appear in the geological record around 5500 BCE, we face our first great mystery. The Sumerian language is an isolate. It has no known relatives. It's not Semitic like Akkadian or Arabic, not Indo-European like Persian or Greek. Where did it come from? Scholars debate this intensely. Some suggest the Sumerians arrived from the east, crossing the Persian Gulf. Others point to the north, noting their religious structure. Ziggurat resemble stepped mountains, suggesting they may have come from a mountainous homeland and tried to recreate their sacred landscape on the flat plains of Mesopotamia. A more recent theory connects them to the flooding of the Black Sea around 5500 BCE, which may have displaced populations southward. Whatever the answer, when they arrived, they merged with the existing Ubaid population in a process of acculturation, not conquest. The archaeological timeline 70 to 900. Let me give you the chronological framework. The Ubaid period, 655–500–400 BCE. Temple foundations at Eridu, agricultural experience. Korofan Hamdi 100 and 900 BCE. Explosion of urbanism. By 3600 BCE, Uruk becomes the first true city, with 40,000 to 80,000 people living behind 6 miles of walls. This period sees the invention of writing, the cylinder seal, monumental architecture, and long-distance networks reaching into Anatolia and Iran. Early dynastic period c. 2900–2334 BCE, the era of competing city-states, legendary kings, and the full flowering of Sumerian culture. Ls. The 3. The Sumerian king list, between myth and history 9 to 15 minutes. The document itself 9–10–15. One of the most fascinating documents from the ancient world is the Sumerian king list. 16 copies survive, all written in Sumerian, composed during the Year 3 period and updated through subsequent dynasties. The premise is simple. Kingship descended from heaven and then moved from city to city as each dynasty fell. The list divides history into 2 epochs, before the flood and after the flood, concept that would later appear in the Hebrew Bible. The antediluvian kings and the meaning of their reigns, 1015 to 1330. Before the flood, the king list records 8 kings ruling across 5 cities for a combined total of 201,200 years, according to the standard version. Consider these figures. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years, Algar, 36,000 years, and Memeluana of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years, and 800 years, Dumuzi the shepherd, 36,000 years, and Sipad Zidana of Larug, 2,100 years, and Mindurana of Sipar, 22,9 years, Ubaratutu of Shurupak, 18,600 years. What are we to make of these impossibly long reigns? This isn't random fantasy. There's a sophisticated numerical system at work. The Sumerians measured these reigns in units called sars, nurs, and sauces. A sar was 3,600 years, a nur was 600 years, a sauce was 60 years. These weren't arbitrary, they were based on the Sumerian sexagesimal system, the base 60 mathematics that gives us 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and 360 degrees in a circle. These numbers are clearly schematic. The Sumerians were making a theological statement, not recording historical fact. The Prediluvian kings were demigods operating on divine timescales. Their impossibly long reigns separate them from ordinary humanity, marking them as figures from a different age, an age when gods walked with kings and death had not yet fully taken hold. But here's what's remarkable. When we compare this list to other ancient traditions, patterns emerge. The Hebrew Bible also lists 10 patriarchs from Adam to Noah. The total of the Sumerian reigns and the ages of the biblical patriarchs appear to be numerically related when you convert between sexagesimal and decimal systems. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BCE, gave 10 antediluvian kings ruling for 42,000 years, number that corresponds to 120 sars. The Hebrew chronology gives 156 years from creation to the flood. It has been ingeniously pointed out that 432,000 years equals 86,400 lustra, 5-year periods, while 656 years equals 86,000 weeks. The Hebrews took the week as their unit. Babylonians took the lustrum. Same pattern, different base. What does this mean? It suggests a common Mesopotamian source for both traditions, a shared mythological heritage that the Hebrews adapted to their own theological framework. The flood, and after 1330 to 1430. Then the flood swept over, the king list tells us flatly. Archaeological evidence confirms a massive flood in the Euphrates Valley around 2900 BCE that devastated many cities. A layer of riverine sediments at Shurupak and as far north as Kish interrupts settlement continuity. This real event became the nucleus around which generations of theological reflection accumulated. After the flood, kingship descends again, but now reigns are measured in hundreds, not thousands, of years still long, but approaching historical plausibility. The first post-Diluvian dynasty is Kish, and here we finally meet historically verified figures. The first historical kings, 1430 to 1500, Enmeberejezi of Kish c. 2600 BCCE, is the earliest ruler on the king list confirmed by contemporary inscriptions. We have his artifacts, his name, and records of his wars against Elam. The king list gives him 900 years, still impossibly long, but moving toward the historical. His son Aga appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh as the Kishite king who besieges Uruk, placing Gilgamesh himself in historical context. Heads. IV. The Great Kings and Rulers, 15 to 19 minutes. Gilgamesh. Fact and legend, 15 to 1630. Speaking of Gilgamesh, he was real. He ruled Uruk around 2700 BCE. The king list credits him with 26 years of rule, but his historical reign was probably 20 to 30 years. The list says his father was a phantom, a curious phrase suggesting divine or uncertain parentage. He became so famous that stories accumulated around him for centuries, eventually coalescing into the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first great work of literature in human history. The historical Gilgamesh likely completed the walls of Uruk, which stretched 6 miles, and made the city virtually impregnable. 500 years after his death, he was worshipped as a deity. The epic portrays him as 2/3 god, 1/3 human, on a quest for immortality, a theme that resonated through all subsequent Mesopotamian literature and influenced Greek and Roman epics. The only queen, Kubaba Tsase 30 to 1750. The king list contains exactly one woman, Kubaba, a tavern keeper who became ruler of Kish around 500 BCE. The text says she made foundations of Kish, Her reign was so successful that her son Puzur-Suin, and then his descendant continued the dynasty for a century. This single entry reminds us that while Sumerian society was patriarchal, exceptional women could still rise to supreme power. Lugeljazi, the unifier before Sargon 17-18-0. Just before the Akkadian conquest, Lugeljazi of Umma and Uruk achieved something remarkable. He united all Sumer under rule for the first time, claiming his dominion stretched from the Lower Sea to the Upper Sea, the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. He ruled for 25 years, but his victory was short-lived. His boastful inscriptions would be captured and defaced by his conqueror, the female priest Enidwana 19. No discussion of Sumerian rulers would complete without Hedwana, not a queen but a priestess and the world's first known author. Daughter of Sargon the Great, she was appointed high priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur. She composed 42 temple hymns and several poems to the goddess Inanna, signing her name to them deliberately. The first time in history an individual claimed authorship of a literary work. Her writings were copied for 500 years after her death. V. The Sumerian Pantheon. Gods and Religion, 19 to 26 minutes. Cosmology and Creation, 19 to 15. The Sumerians saw the universe as a cosmic state, with gods functioning like an eternal assembly. Before creation, there was only Namu, the primeval sea, a formless abyss. Namu, through an act of self-procreation, gave birth to an heaven and Ki, Earth, who were originally united as a single cosmic mountain. Their union produced Enlil, the god of air, who separated his parents, creating the space between heaven and earth where life could exist. This separation is the Sumerian creation event, the moment the universe became ordered. The major deities, 2015 to 2245. An. The sky-fathered An was the supreme authority, the source of all legitimate power, but he was a distant figure. He did not interfere directly in human affairs. His symbol was the horned crown, and his primary temple was at Uruk. Kings derived their authority from him, but they prayed to other gods for practical help. Enlil, the executive power. If An was the distant king, Enlil was the prime minister, the active force in the universe. Lord of wind and the earth, he was called, the great mountain and the raging storm. His temple Iker in Nippur was the religious center of Sumer. Enlil was dangerous. He decided to destroy humanity with the flood, because their noise disturbed his sleep. But he was also the source of kingship. No ruler was legitimate without Enlil's blessing. Enki, the clever god Enki, later Ea, was entirely different, the god of fresh water, wisdom, magic, and crafts. He lived not in heaven but in the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean. Enki was the friend of humanity. When Enlil decided to destroy people with the flood, Enki warned the pious king to build an ark. He was the civilizing force, the one who filled the Tigris and Euphrates with fish and taught humanity arts and crafts. Inanna, the complex goddess, Inanna, later Ishtar, is the most complex figure in the pantheon, goddess of love, sex, fertility, and war. She was ambitious, jealous, lustful, and vengeful. Her symbol was the eight-pointed star, representing the planet Venus, which appears as both morning and evening star, mirroring her dual nature. The most famous myth about her, Inanna's descent to the netherworld, sees her attempt to usurp power from her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. She fails and must be rescued, but only by providing a substitute, her own husband Dumuzi. This myth explains the cycle of seasons. Dumuzi spends half the year in the underworld, half with Inanna. The Anunnaki, Divine Assembly, 2245 to 2500. Now that we've met the individual gods, we need to understand how they functioned as a group. The Sumerians conceived of the divine realm as a cosmic assembly, and at its heart were the Anunnaki. The name itself tells us something important. Anunnaki comes from Sumerian, meaning princely offspring or royal seed. They were initially understood as the most powerful deities, the direct descendants of An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess. This was as the divine aristocracy, the ruling council of the universe. But here's where it gets complex. The texts are inconsistent about who exactly belonged to this group. The earliest writings from the reign of Gudea around 244 BCE apply the term to the most important gods. Most scholars believe the core group was the seven gods who decree: An, Il, Enki, Ninursag, Nana, Utu, and Inanna. These seven were the supreme court, the ones who determined the fates of humanity. Their primary function in early Sumerian mythology was precisely that, to decree human destinies. In the poem Enki and the World Order, we read that the Anunnaki do homage to Enki and decree the fates of mankind. They were the cosmic decision makers, the divine parliament. But over time, their role shifted dramatically. By the time we get to the Akkadian and Babylonian periods, the Anunnaki become increasingly associated with the underworld. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, they appear as the seven judges of the dead, setting the land aflame as the flood approaches. In Inanna's descent to the underworld, it's the Anunnaki who step forward to judge the goddess for her audacity in trying to overthrow her sister Ereshkigal. They condemn her to death, a stark reminder that even gods were subject to their judgment. This duality is fascinating. The Anunnaki were both heavenly rulers and underworld judges. They transcended the boundary between the realms. The Hittites and Hurrians, who adopted Mesopotamian mythology, identified them as former gods banished to the netherworld, and invoked them in treaties to ensure oaths were kept. Importantly, archaeologists have never found evidence that the Anunnaki were worshipped collectively. There were no temples to the Anunnaki as a group. Instead, each god had their own individual cult in different cities. In the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, Marduk assigns 300 Anunnaki to heaven and 300 to earth. But this number varies across texts, sometimes 50 associated with Eridu, sometimes 7 as underworld judges. The Anunnaki were less a fixed pantheon and more a flexible concept of divine authority. In later Babylonian tradition, they built Esagila, the great temple of Marduk in Babylon, as a gesture of gratitude after Marduk defeated Tiamat and ordered the cosmos. The gods themselves became architects and laborers in service of the new cosmic order. So when we hear modern popular culture speak of the Anunnaki as alien visitors, we need to understand what the texts actually say. The Anunnaki were not astronauts. They were the foundational concept of divine authority in Mesopotamian thought, the celestial judges whose decrees shaped human fate. The flood myth, divine judgment and human survival 25 Zibbers, Hinti 600. We cannot discuss Sumerian mythology without addressing the flood more deeply. The most complete account comes from the Epic of Atrahasis, composed around 1700 BCE, but based on older Sumerian traditions. Here's the story. The gods created humanity to perform labor that the lower gods, the Igigi, had refused to do. But humanity multiplied and became noisy. Their clamor kept Enlil awake at night. Enlil decided to destroy humanity with a flood, but Enki warned a righteous man named Atrahasis, exceedingly wise. Enki told him to build a boat, to pitch it within and without, and to bring aboard his family and the animals. When the flood came, Adad the storm god unleashed waters so devastating that the brother did not see his brother, the father did not find his son. After 7 days the flood subsided. Atrahasis offered sacrifices to the gods. And here's a poignant detail. The gods, who had been deprived of offerings during the flood, gathered like flies around the sacrifice. They had destroyed humanity, but they hadn't considered the consequences. No worshippers meant no food. Enlil was furious that someone had survived, but Enki argued that destroying humanity entirely was excessive. A compromise was reached. Humanity would continue, but death and suffering would be introduced to keep populations in check. The underworld 26, Tucci City 630. The Sumerian afterlife was grim. The underworld, called Kur or Urkala, was a land of no return, a dusty, dark cavern where the dead ate dust and wore feathers like birds. There was no reward for the righteous, no punishment for the wicked. Everyone ended up there, regardless of their deeds in life. Ruled by Ereshkigal and later her consort Nergal, it was a place of such despair that Sumerian prayers often begged the gods for long life on earth, since death offered no hope. Nerlaof. VI. Daily Life Science and Culture 26 to 30 minutes. Education and the Aduba 6 to 2700. The Sumerians invented formal education. The Aduba, the tablet house, trained scribes from morning to night. Excavations have recovered school exercises, student essays, and even complaints from students. One famous text, School Days, describes a student's day. Wake early, bring lunch to school, receipt tablets, write new tablets, and face corporal punishment for mistakes. Another text records a father's advice to his son. Love the scribal art as your mother, let it lead you in beauty. Mediscience 27 to 2800. Sumerian medicine blended magic and empirical practice. Physicians diagnosed illnesses and prescribed treatments, while exorcists performed rituals. Surgical instruments have been found and medical texts list hundreds of herbal remedies. They understood anatomy reasonably well and could set fractures and perform basic surgeries. Their mathematical achievements were extraordinary. Using a base 60 system, they calculated areas, volumes, and square roots. This system gives us 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and 360 degrees in a circle direct Sumerian inheritance. Hydraulic engineering 28 to 2900. Perhaps their greatest practical achievement was hydraulic engineering. The Sumerians built an enormous system of canals, dikes, weirs, and reservoirs to control the rivers and irrigate their fields. This required centralized administration. Someone had to coordinate cleaning the canals, allocating water, and repairing breaches. This necessity for cooperation is exactly what drove the development of government and writing. Records show officials tracking water allocations, resolving disputes, and organizing labor for maintenance. Literature and music, 29 to 3000. Beyond Gilgamesh, the Sumerians produced a vast literature: hymns to gods, love poetry, wisdom literature, proverbs, and disputations texts where two opposing things argue, like summer versus winter or axe vs plow. One of their most beautiful works is the Lament for mourning the destruction of the city. We even have music. The Hurrian Hymn No. 6, written in cuneiform around 400 BCE, but based on older Sumerian traditions, is the oldest surviving notated in the world. It includes instructions for a 9-stringed lyre and shows so sophisticated musical theory. ECD. The Fall, Decline and Transformation, 38 to 34 minutes. The Akkadian Conquest 3100. Around 334 BCE, Sargon of Akkad, a Semitic speaker from the north, conquered the Sumerian city-states and created the world's first empire. Sargon's story echoes Moses. Legend's priestess mother set him in a basket on the river, where a gardener found and raised him. He rose to be cupbearer to the king of Kish, then seized power, built the new capital Agade, and conquered from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Sargon didn't destroy Sumerian culture, he adopted it. He appointed his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess at and Akkadian rulers wrote in Sumerian alongside their own language. But Sumer had lost its political independence. The Renaissance, 3100. After the Akkadian Empire collapsed under Guchan invasions, Sumer briefly revived. The third dynasty of Urse, 2004 BCE, ruled a centralized state that controlled much of Mesopotamia. King Ur-Nammu issued the oldest known law code, predating Hammurabi by 3 centuries. His laws established fixed penalties, protected the weak from the strong, and standardized weights and measures. He also rebuilt Ur's Great Ziggurat, which still stands today. Environmental collapse 3300. But the revival couldn't last. Geoevidence points to a 200 to 300-year drought beginning around 200 years ago. The Red Sea and Dead Sea show increased evaporation. Lake Van in Turkey dropped dramatically. Dust levels in marine sediments spiked. Rainfall in Mesopotamia decreased substantially. Archaeological surveys tell a stark story. At sites like Tel Leilan in Syria, 74% of settlements were abandoned, and populated area shrank by 93%. When the rains failed, the irrigation system couldn't compensate. Salinization poisoned the soil, and crop yields plummeted. Famine followed. Final destruction 3400. Into this weakened state came invaders, Elamites from the east and Amorites from the west. Around 2000 BCE, they sacked destroyed the Third Dynasty, and ended Sumerian political power forever. The city was so completely devastated that a generation later, a Sumerian poet wrote the lamentation over describing streets choked with corpses, gates destroyed, and the goddess Ningal weeping over her abandoned city. The legacy and conclusion. Where are the Sumerians today? 34 to 36 minutes. Cultural absorption 34 to 3500. The Sumerian people did not vanish, they were absorbed. Their language gradually died out as a spoken tongue around 2800 BCE, replaced by Akkadian. But Sumerian survived as a written language of scholarship and liturgy for another 2,000 years, like Latin in medieval Europe. Babylonian priests still recited Sumerian hymns in 100 CE, nearly 3,000 years after the language was last spoken. Their enduring gifts, 35 to 600. What did the Sumerians leave us? Writing, the very concept of recording thought. Time. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees. The first written legal codes, literature, the first epic, first love poetry, first laments. the idea of the city as a center of civilization, religion, mythological themes that echo in the Bible and Greek mythology. The modern inhabitants of Iraq live on the land where it all began. The marshes of southern Iraq, drained by Saddam Hussein but now being restored, still echo with the ancient ways reed houses, water fishing, that the first Sumerians practiced 7,000 years ago. Final thought 3600. The Sumerians wrote the first chapter of human history. They were the first to ask, in writing, the questions we still ask. Why are we here? What happens after death? How should we live together? Their answers shaped everything that followed. When you look at your watch, when you read a book, when you consider the law, you are touching something the Sumerians invented. They are not gone. They live in us.